was kicked off by our interview with Michael Gerard, looking at questions of sovereignty, jurisdiction, governance, territoriality, the future political scenarios that might be presented by these types of shifting geographies. But we want to do it, at least to a certain extent, with three specific terms in mind. By way of a brief introduction, myself, Ed Keller, and Benjamin Bratton have been engaged in a series of conversations, and in their case, 2 classes that they've been teaching, that we've been loosely speaking calling Google Arctic Mars. The idea is to take those 3 terms as indicative or emblematic of emerging quote-unquote territorial conditions that require a new type of politics or that offer a new possibilities for the fiction of the state, as we were just talking about with Michael Gerard. We'll have some self-introductions right now, so you'll understand a little bit more what we're talking about when we say Google, which is shorthand for quite a large series of sort of cloud practices and cloud citizenship. And when we say Mars, I'd actually probably say we really mean off-world or post-planetary, but nonetheless Mars is a convenient shorthand for the sort of the universal or planetary other. And then Arctic is my jurisdiction. So we're going to do brief self-introductions for the 3 of us doing Google Arctic Mars, and then I'll introduce Tom Cohen, who's also on the panel with us tonight. And then Ed will introduce our Skype guests, who are from all over the world. So the Arctic, I'll just give the briefest introduction. As someone who writes in pretty broad terms about landscape and architecture, I've been really fascinated over the last few years to see how climate change in particular is causing unexpected and sometimes quite drastic terrestrial shifts that have impacts on the definition of a state, the reach of a state, the borders that a state might have or ascribe to itself or want to claim. And the Arctic is a particularly interesting example of a polar region that is opening up to entirely new types of possibilities of jurisdiction, of economic activity, and so on. I guess I'd say, really broadly speaking, there are 3 particular things that I've been focusing on that. One is the famous example of the Russian submarine that went down to the North Pole, descended to the bottom of the seabed and planted a titanium flag of Russia on the seabed there. And it was it harks back to, in fact, it reminds me of there's an old sketch on Kids in the Hall, where the comedy show where a bunch of sovereign powers walk into a hospital room and keep claiming the chest of a man who's on an emergency bed. So they claim this chest in the name of Spain. Anyway, the sort of comedy of territorial claim really sort of came to fore with planting a titanium flag down there. So it's not that actually has any kind of it doesn't set a precedent. It doesn't mean that anyone's actually done anything. It's a party trick. But nonetheless, it was an indication that Russia takes seriously the idea that the whole idea is that they will have mineral rights over the Arctic seabed if they can prove that the continental shelf extends from northern Russia out into the Arctic Sea in an unbroken manner, and then they will get they effectively have the mineral rights for all of the land that is connected to that continental shelf. As it happens, at least from my reading in territorial law and other international law, that they actually seem to have a pretty good case for having the mineral rights to the Arctic seabed. So we'll have to see how that turns out. So it's kind of like one case. The other, and a very obvious one, is the Northwest Passage that cuts through Canada. It's a really interesting example of territorial definition, the kind of the words we use to define certain terrains or types of terrains. There's a conflict, a kind of a rhetorical conflict between the United States and Canada over what exactly the Northwest Passage is. In extremely broad terms, Canada claims that it is an internal waterway, and that because it passes through the center of Canada effectively, albeit in the Arctic North, that it's very clearly Canadian water. It's almost similar to the Mississippi River. That it's something that it is Canadian. They have jurisdiction over it. They can stop vessels from using it. They have the ability to police it, et cetera, to police access to it. The United States, on the other hand, says that it is actually an international waterway, and that therefore the U.S. vessels, for instance, should have no reason whatsoever to tell Canada that they're sending a ship up there. And there's some really interesting sort of Great Game style machinations up there. There are things where, on a territorial level, because of the width of the Northwest Passage, the U.S. actually has a justifiable claim for arguing that it's an international waterway. The width is such that it is not considered an internal waterway. On the other hand, there are huge security implications of calling it an international waterway, such as any military in the world could send ships through it without asking for Canadian permission to pass. That means in the sort of Rumsfeldian political doomsday worst case scenarios that we tend to deal with increasingly in popular culture today, it means that a foreign navy, the Chinese Navy, could park a ship in the Northwest Passage and fire missiles at New York City. These sorts of war game scenarios are something that are taken seriously in the definition of that. But then also things like nuclear submarines passing through the Northwest Passage. If it's navigated enough times without telling Canada, it sets up basically a precedent that means that therefore it is navigable, therefore it's an international waterway, et cetera, et cetera. The point is not to argue about that, but to simply highlight that as emblematic of the kind of shifting arguments and everything from rhetoric to navigable sea charts is up for grabs with the Northwest Passage. And then the other one obviously is the tar. Well, I shouldn't say obviously, but it is the tar sands boom or the energy explosion in the Arctic North. The tar sands are specifically in Canada. But as these landscapes are thawing, and as the price of oil or petroleum products in general exceeds a certain limit, it's suddenly worth the money, the extraordinary money and environmental damage to extract these from the earth. So things like tar sands, which would normally be an outrageous activity to engage in, it suddenly actually can turn a profit. That then touches on things like the Keystone XL pipeline that has been in the news lately, that the American Republican Party is keen on passing as a job creation mechanism, a kind of massive infrastructural project through the center of the United States, and that it has, in my opinion, thankfully been voted down by the Obama administration. But in any case, you see these kind of the energy booms in the north throughout the sort of circumpolar north. So that raises questions of infrastructure, it raises questions of energy futures, it raises questions of quote-unquote sustainability, going green, who builds these, the construction of whole new cities in the north. There was a gentleman named Lawrence Smith at UCLA who's a geographer, and his whole idea is that the Canadian north will soon be like Nevada. It'll have these sparkling Las Vegas-like cities up in the plains of northern Canada, and that we're now seeing this kind of almost the Dubaization of the Canadian North. So in any case, all of those things are things that I think are really quite interesting there, and they are what and tonight when we say Arctic, all of those things and more are more or less what we mean when we say that. And so we'll be discussing that more or less all night. So with that, I'll throw it over to Benjamin for his introduction of the Google part of this triad.
Yeah, thank you, Geoff. And also hello to my class in San Diego. I was watching the class that I'm doing with them right now is on Google and the future of Google, and taking Google as one of the key players in this question of how we can rethink and recompose notions of sovereignty, territory, and so forth. And as Geoff said, the way in which we're thinking about Google has less to do with the specific publicly traded company based in Mountain View, though we're looking at it quite carefully, than it has to do with thinking about the cloud and planetary scale computation as a whole, as a kind of distributed, discontiguous infrastructural network that provides, nonetheless, in its image, conditions of identity, identification, commerce, transaction, and so forth that are, regardless of the permission we may be able to get the United Nations to provide, taking over some of the functions that the state had previously taken over. So let me introduce a little bit of the themes and ideas, and specifically what we're looking at here. The first Sino-Google war of 2009 may well be the opening crack in a very different kind of war over who or what governs society. one less between two superpowers than between two logics of territorial control. One of these sees the internet as the extension of the body of the state, or at least beneath the state in the priorities of sovereignty, that being China. And another which sees the internet as a kind of living, quasi-autonomous, if also privately controlled and profited, trans-territorial civil society, which produces, defends, and demands rights of its own. So for this, Google is a non-state actor acting with the force of a state, but which, unlike modern states, is not defined by a single specific territorial contiguity. So while Google is as reliant on real physical infrastructure, its data centers are by no means virtual, that physicality is more dispersed and distributed than partitioned and circumscribed. One example I'd like to think about this, you probably know this, but a couple of years ago now, someone in Mountain View, for reasons that are still a bit occult at this point, loaded a different map of Central America into Google Earth, and in doing so, redrew the line of the borderline between Nicaragua and Costa Rica at Google Earth. The result of this was that Nicaragua mobilized their army and took about 150 yards, I believe, of new land that Mountain View had ceded it as well. Which seems like a fun curiosity, blah, 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 but the history of states and the history of what states do primarily has been, I think Lewis and Clark and so forth, to empirically describe the territory over which they make a claim. You know? And that empirical geographic objective state. On top of that, then there's all kinds of private economies and corporate actors and civil society and the rest of this. But the objectivity of territory itself is something that the state determines. And here we have a kind of flip in that stack, where the private entity, the corporate player, is determining the facticity of territory on which these state actors might move. This, I think, is important, I think, historically. Think of this as well, perhaps, in terms of the breach theory of one Dr. Fan Bingjing. Fan Bingjing is an academician, he's an engineer at the China Academy of Engineering, and one of the main designers of the infamous China Great Firewall. In November of last year, he warned a conference, that China Internet does not yet have the capability to disable a global internet service provider whenever it chooses to. And he used the example of Google and said that it was a pity that although Google had retreated from China, he lamented that its service was still accessible. And this is a direct quote. "It's like the relationship between a riverbed and a river. Water has no nationalities, but riverbeds are sovereign territories. We cannot allow polluted water from other nation states to enter our country." Unquote. And to me, this is a kind of amazingly succinct repetition of the older European logic of dividing of land and sea, what Carl Schmitt called the nomos of the earth, a kind of juridical diction of land and sea over what stage delta plays into some kind of Confucian parable type of phrase. And it's likely that perhaps Dr. Feng was unfamiliar with Buckminster Fuller's admonition that the fearful sovereign nation politicals will find that trying to arrest networking is like trying to arrest the waves of an ocean, as it is unlikely that Fuller was ever given the assignment, as Dr. Feng was, of building a glass dome for 1 billion internet users. Now, here the issues of practical political design become a little bit more complex. What are the national rights, or sovereign rights, if we call them, of mobile subjects in a cloud society? Can you be bound to the data laws of your passport country, no matter where you go? You have the passport of a country, you access the cloud from one location, dependent on what the data laws and the conditions of access that are bound to you and your passport. Does that follow you wherever you go as you move through the world? Can your cloud follow you and you it? Or can, in fact, your cloud be your primary sovereign territory? that the conditions of identification and access and legal boundaries to you and the identity, economic, political, and otherwise, are going to be the primary identity by which you work with? Should individual servers fly the flag of a certain state and disseminate data according to those laws, even if that server may be all the way across the world? And if you go to a data center now, this is kind of what you see, this amazing kind of cloud enclave structure where you've got server racks with a Japanese flag on them and a Korean flag and a Chinese flag in the same location, in the same data center, kind of segmentation of the legal structures of data connected to these sorts of pipes. These are all bizarre kinds of solutions. Or really is it simply that wherever the laws happen to be, wherever you happen to be standing at one particular time, the last mile determines all conditions of sovereignty from going forth with that. All of these options are extraordinarily counterintuitive, but what other options are there? What if the server farms are outside of territorial waters altogether? And 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago now, Google filed a patent for offshore data centers. The logic for offshore data centers is very clear. If you're going to trying to build a global internet for the next 2 billion users, energy and cooling of the data centers is your primary concern. So putting them offshore, where you have all the water you need, all the tidal power you need, makes sense. But you see the issue here. If the actual physical infrastructure of the cloud is also outside of the Westphalian circumscription, then these issues the complexities of the issues are just multiplied. Actually, you know what, let me leave it at that. I've got more to say on this sort of blue stuff as well, but I think to keep the symmetry between these introductions in order, let me leave it at that, and some of the other issues around Google and religious fundamentalism and the rest of it we'll bring in a little bit later as we go along the line. So with that, let me hand it over to Ed.
I think your phone is getting texts or something.
No, you know what it is? It's a...
So yeah, it's like it's all instruction.
Hey, so I'm Ed Keller at Parsons, New School for Design, and we've been running a course this spring.
Landline dudes.
We've been running a course this spring called Post-Planetary Design. I think that fitting within the Google Arctic Mars trifecta, which I guess we can reframe it a number of different ways. It could be something like the non-anthropocentric noosphere, climate change, and off-planet. It could be a range of different definitions. One quote rang very, very resonant for me from Kubrick back in the late 60s, right around the time he was finishing 2001. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he essentially said, "We must find deep meaning despite existential risk. For the final analysis, there may be no sound way to eliminate the threat of self-extinction without changing human nature. The infant mortality rate among emerging civilizations in the cosmos may be very high." Now, in the course, the Post-Planetary Design course that we've been running, we've touched on the work of people like Kubrick, Peter Watts, who is joining us here on screen, a range of science fiction writers, all of whom are very hard science fiction writers, dealing with this question of existential risk. And I want to unpack that just for a brief moment. About a year and a half ago, we ran a lecture series at Parsons called Design and Existential Risk, which Geoff participated in, which Benjamin participated in, a range of other folks like Bruce Sterling, Keller Easterling, Mark Wigley, Robin Hansen, and others, specifically to ask the question what design can do when faced with these kinds of planetary scale problems that ultimately are existential risk problems. And in the course of those conversations, and in connection to some previous work actually that I had been doing at SIRE at Columbia around post-empire, the phrase post-planetary came up really. And it seemed like it was the point where a series of concerns that had preoccupied both myself and us, and some of the people that we've invited in that I'll introduce in a moment online here. These were all tied together in the frame of the post-planetary. And so in the course and in the research that we're doing, in the conversations that Ben and Geoff and I are having, I guess I'd like to ask what's at stake at the post-planetary scale. When we talk about design, we usually talk about objects, supply chains, recycling, localities in relationship to regions, and occasionally, more often, globalities. But if you think about design at the planetary infrastructural scale, a whole host of other issues come to light. Not only physical issues, but time frame issues. And now I harken back to a conversation that Ben and I were having last night, and a talk that Ben gave at the Mobility Shifts conference a few months ago at Parsons at the New School. Time frames, decades, centuries, or millennia through which culture can operate, through which the diagram of culture can operate, through which programs can operate, and obviously across which the postplanetary immediately operates. When you talk about the postplanetary, you're always talking about, planetary and postplanetary are always talking about millennia all the way up through billions of years. And so we can't really think of design, if we talk about design for the century, design for the next 25 years, I think we can't really talk about design without taking it off planet. If we make it through the next 50 years, 25 to 50 years, we will be working off planet in some way, substantially. I mean, obviously we're already working off planet in terms of global communications, but on a broader manufacturing level, and of course from the Ballardian point of view, a kind of a cultural time shock, a culture shock level. So I would say then that maybe one of the themes that we've been testing in the postplanetary seminar has been to ask whether the ultimate design strategy always takes into account planetary and larger scales of design. And of course, because it's partly been hard science fiction, and because it's partly something that I think we need to look at, we immediately talk about alien life in this context. And alien life can be everything from the kind of encounter that Peter Watts engages in his novel Blindside, to the kind of discussion that we were having last night here with Lynn Rothschild when we're talking about exobiology, xenobiology, and synthetic biology. So one of the other frames that comes into focus when we start talking about the planetary and the postplanetary, especially around synthetic biology, is what it means when we engineer not only the large-scale infrastructures at a planetary scale, at a continental and planetary scale, but what it means for the planet when we start engineering things at a very small scale. And just to put that in perspective, Lynn brought this up last night, from a different point of view, you can look at the history of the management of metals on the scale of the entire planet, and understand that metals have not moved around the surface of our planet only because of tectonic movement. They have moved because of bacterial activity over billions of years. The banded iron deposits that are mined are largely bacterial deposits, byproducts of bacterial life. And you see that if you start scaling out that kind of life to the billion-year time frame, you start seeing a planetary scale, let's say, interaction. And so one of the arguments that we're trying to make, that we're investigating in the postplanetary research, is to say when the Anthropocene, which is the age that we're in right now, where humans can literally affect the planet, have a planetary scale effect. Within the Anthropocene, when we start engineering, according to what we heard last night from Lynn, not only the exobiology, but the synthetic biology level, then we start to operate both within the time frame within which we live, but also within a much larger time frame. And of course, the design variables that we start to think about when we leave behind the human-centered model of ecology, whether it's off-planet alien life or on-planet alien life, when we leave behind the human-centered model of an epistemological construct, these are all tied back to the question of planetary and postplanetary. And of course, then we ask questions about what forms of politics, what forms of governance, what forms of economy, what forms of individual and collective sovereignty emerge when we start to interact with what we used to think was a primarily morphological or a geological time frame, when humans actually are active agents within that time frame. So we've been considering this full spectrum of risks and benefits in the research that we've been doing in the seminar, and I've continually been looking for ways to tie them back into some of the discussions that Benjamin and Geoff and I have been having in previous conversations with Adrian Lahoud and with Peter Watts. And there's also this as well, and I'll read you a brief quote here. As I gazed at it, on that far-gone night, it seemed to call across the unthinkable void, to lure me to it, to draw me as the lodestone attracts a particle of iron. My longing was beyond the power of opposition. I closed my eyes, stretched out my arms toward the God of my vocation, and felt myself drawn with the suddenness of thought through the trackless immensity of space. And any of you who in your younger days read an awful lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs will recognize that quote from the opening lines of his John Carter Willard of Mars series. Purple prose at its best, but that is a nice way of linking back to the question of Google, Arctic, and Mars. And before we transition out of this, I just want to also introduce our three guests. Right now in the large frame is Dylan Trigg, philosopher, author of Aesthetics of Decay, among other pieces. On the lower left, Adrian Lahoud, urban designer, architect, director of the Urban Design Program, Master's Program at the Bartlett, co-editor of 80s issue Post-Traumatic Urbanism. And on the right, Peter Watts, biologist and science fiction author, author of many novels and shorter stories, including Blind Sight, which we looked at in our PostPlanetary seminar this semester, the Rifters trilogy, short stories like The Island, and so forth.
Cool. Yeah, and I also want to introduce our final panelist here. This is Tom Cohen on my right. Tom and I actually go back nearly, frighteningly, in fact, about 16 years. Tom was one of my undergraduate thesis advisors at UNC Chapel Hill, and we have kept in touch since, and he's now a co-editor with Claire Colebrook of a series called Critical Climate Change, published by the Open Humanities Press. And I've always enjoyed the conversations with Tom about very many of these same topics, going from the radically what we might even call alloplanetary, I suppose, going back to some of our early conversations as opposed to the post-planetary, and questions of everything from human extinction to the very possibility of there not being a human at all. And I thought that it would be fun to have you as a voice on the panel. So thanks, Tom. I guess taking on the role of moderator as well as participant. I guess I'm really interested, maybe going back to some of the topics that came up in the Michael Gerard interview about what comes after the nation and what comes after the nation state, if there are nation states. And I guess I'd just like to maybe throw that open, maybe starting, Benjamin, with you about some of the possibilities for looking at new sovereign or territorial fictions, including giving up those words altogether for some new regime of action or a regime of influence that doesn't correspond to the nation state.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I hope so. And my answer, my thoughts on this may be more, as we were speaking over the break, the sort of more specification of the question and what's at stake for the question. I think it may be the first thing. And that is, I think it's important for us to be very clear that the kinds of planetary design, geo-design, we can say, geography and geology and geophilosophy, but the kinds of geo-design that Ed is talking about is not something that might happen at some point, or not something that we could entertain as a good project to begin in some way, but is a recognition that is what we have always been, for better or worse, been doing, and that, for example, in issues of climate change and radicality, we can't really think about the history of food and agriculture without understanding the kinds of transformations that we've made on the planet to begin with. So there's the physical redesign of the planet as a space, as what Timothy Martin calls a hyper object, but the design of the planet as a structure. But to the question that came up with the discussions with Michael, it's important, I think, to also, when we talk about things like the nation state, the stability of the nation state, the particular relationship between territory and sovereignty, the ways in which a common relationship to an infrastructure bequeaths and interpolates a citizen a user of that infrastructure, as the precondition of citizenship, by which it determines who and what can and cannot be represented to a polis, from which anything like we might want to imagine a cosmopolitan or cosmopolis type of arrangement might derive. That the systems that we have inherited and into which we work were designed, that they have histories, that they are specific, that they are contingent, that they were not necessarily voted on in a particular point, but nevertheless we've inherited them, and there they are. That the Treaty of Westphalia and the organization by which it became a kind of stable adjudication, that the contiguity of territory would describe land, describe adjacencies of land, and within those loops, that loop geometry of the contiguity, that currency and army and flag and World Cup team and all the other kinds of media of the state would be divided, as opposed to the sea, as opposed to the air, as opposed to any of the other ways in which we could have subdivided the planet. That those decisions were partial and they were contingent, and that they are always mutable. And the question is not should we enter into a discussion of their possible mutability, but first recognizing that they're mutable and that they're always in change, and what is the condition of change that we may want to politicize, and how would we politicize them in this particular kind of way. So this is why, in a nutshell, I see the issues of what counts as sovereignty, what its media are, what its substrates and substructures are, how it presents itself and represents itself in the world, and how we enter into it, what its points of interfaciality are for us as a design problem. Now, why specifically is this interesting today? Well, one of the books that's been very important for me in writing the book that I've written on this issue, particularly in relation to planetary computation, was Carl Schmitt's book, The Nomos of the Earth, 1950. Carl Schmitt, of course, is a ubiquitous bad guy in political theory. But his book, The Nomos on the Earth, was one of his later works, and I won't try to summarize it here, but I'll simply make the point, is that his argument for why it was in 1648, in the late 17th century, that the European powers decided the need to formalize and standardize the relationships between geography, territory, sovereignty, and the formal conditions of the state was partially due to the encounter with the open, free soil of the New World, and that it was the challenge of an unsubdivided space, of an unnamed space, of an undetermined space, that in a way necessitated the formalization of the spaces that were of the homeland, as it were. So one of the ways I would want to sort of historicize this moment, but which we're looking at things like planetary computation, global internet, and the cloud, and so forth and so on. I think part of the reason these issues of sovereignty and territory and so forth are on the table as they are today, and they seem mutable, and they seem plastic, and they seem open for revision, is that we are in one way or another encountering other forms of free soil, if you like, either whether that's the internet, whether that's the Arctic, whether that's the open planet. And it's that encounter with the unmarked that puts the marked in question again.
Nice. Tom, I have a question for you, actually. It's sort of a double-headed question. One is just the question of the politics of what we refer to as the human. One of the things that we're taking for granted right now is that we're talking about human political organizations, or Ed used the term anthropocentric. And I guess I'm interested in that in relation to the second part of this question, which is specific to climate change. You specifically say critical climate change, but also in your work and from conversations with you, I know that climate change is not just a question of rising sea levels and melting ice caps, but the interruption of a very large, or the very notion that there's a human project underway, that there's a human civilization, that there's a human future, human past, etc. And I guess I'm just curious about if you could talk about the critical climate change series, what it means and what you're after with it, but then also how that affects and how it interrupts the notion of a human project underway.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's a big question. I guess part of that was coming into my mind with the remarks that Benjamin was making and this discussion I walked into about the disappearing island. And I don't count the end of that, but I know when things disappear, there's a great deal of effort to kind of keep them there in some capacity and, you know, transport the sovereignty to some other place or keep, but it has disappeared. And it does strike me the question of sovereignty as the way we use it is perhaps, you know, misleading. I don't want to really go into that, but I want to put an asterisk there because it is the way we talk about things and we presume that it exists and we be granted. But if you look around the current geopolitical, financial structure of the game, it's very hard to locate specifically. You're losing sovereignty in Europe right now to the banks and the political system, et cetera, here, and even in places as far flung as China, losing that decision possibility. But I'm getting off track in a way I'm not. The series just underlines this word critical, and it doesn't mean critical because the islands are going down only. I'm asking, as you say, what interests me are this enormous kind of cognitive rupture that attends this new information. Or if you want to call it the Anthropocene or not, when we're asked, as we've already been hearing, to think with a different scale, to anticipate a suddenly different relation to what used to be called history that overleaps the cultural fetishes that we kind of come out of, and to contemplate this possibility of a decision that would correspond to that we don't seem capable of making collectively or otherwise. And as you think these things through, if you follow, like in the last decade of how this has emerged, we're wondering in this broader impasse to which activities like yours are the correct and interesting response, which is combine, invent, create virtual possibilities to rethink. But to me, the real question is, how do you get that point of rethinking where there's something irreversible is introduced, where we're not rehearsing and recycling 20th century kind of humanistic concepts that held us together, because suddenly you're looking at very real questions of species extinction that include our own. You've raised them already a few times. And how does one orient towards that that's not a reaction, not the attempt to hold on, not the attempt to reposition what's there? Because you see that being played out in everything from Wall Street to the kind of philosophies that circulate through the university. You know, they basically are always busy to reestablish their sentiment there. So what interests me is where the concepts start to mutate with this situation. What is being asked of our thinking or our perception or our relation to alter seriously, not just to reassemble itself. And that's a kind of open question. That's where perhaps this question of extinction comes in as an almost positive thought, that one is no longer oriented constantly to holding back what one's potentially losing. You have to realize we've been here, what, in terms of cultural history, 3,000, 5,000 years of technology of writing. You know, our modernity, 100, 200 years old in terms of its kind of hyper, you know, exponential development. That's nothing. That's the fly speck, and these are the other terms that you have to think. That's why even the term Anthropocene is double-sided. On the one hand, it's the pure expression of the hubris of anthropomorphism, anthropomorphic life. You know, it says, take control, we'll be the designers of the earth, we're the gods of the earth. It goes different ways. On the other hand, it's already something that can only be given that name or seen from the next point of view, that is some other species, aliens, insects that replace us, who could then look back and say, oh yeah, there was this Anthropocene. So the second you have a category or a word like that, it's kind of bad news. It means, you know, virtually it's over, in some sense. You know, it's a retro term.
Nice mic on. We are still here.
I'll pass the baton.
Maybe I can check with Adrian. Yeah, although he seems to have evaporated. Oh, Adrian, are you there?
I know, it's like on a bathroom break.
Maybe he went to bed.
It is very late in Europe for about anything we're doing. So,
16.
are you guys there?
He's
Can
16.
you give us a thumbs up? Peter? You guys there?
I'm here.
Yeah, very good. Peter, we can hear you.
That's good.
So, you've been following this conversation?
Yeah, except every 13 and a half minutes I get some kind of an ad for jazz that kind of cuts out 30 or 40 seconds, so I've been missing bits of it.
Okay.
That was us.
Well, actually, I was thinking, Geoff and I were thinking it would be interesting to fold you and Adrian in on this one, and specifically, Peter, on the question of what comes after the nation state. And actually, it could be interesting to Dylan to bring you into this as well, but let's start with Peter. Tom had just brought up this question of really facing what comes after from a non-anthropocentric point of view. The phrase that he used was where something irreversible is introduced. And that immediately, and also another term that Tom used was a cognitive rupture that attends the emergence of a new kind of, let's say, ensemble of sovereignties. And that made me immediately think of the work that you've done in both Rifters and in Blindsight, where you specifically identify, let's start perhaps in Rifters, where you identify both a technological but a biological set of forces. Now this isn't quite climate, but it is a set of forces on a geological scale that then force humanity to adjust everything about the way it interacts with technology, the way that governments are formed, and so forth. So
I think you get jazzed. He's being jazzed right now.
So could you? That's right. So could you unpack a little bit around this idea of what form, for example, of sovereignty exists after the nation state based on the catalog?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. We hear you well.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to start over again. Right in the middle of your question,
You got jazzed.
there was some kind of an ad for a baseball app on the iPhone.
Skype come to that.
It's good because
Okay, so I'll summarize.
I think we've got probably about 13 and a half minutes before we get interrupted again.
Okay. So here it is in short then. The question around what happens after the nation state, and specifically one line that Tom used, that there's a cognitive rupture that attends this kind of moment, struck me, and the question of what happens when something irreversible is introduced. Adrian, I'm running a question right now to Peter. So Peter, specifically in Rifters, you posited a scenario where, because of a biological incident and a series of technological incidents, the entire substrate of what governance is reconfigured. So I wonder if you could address that a little bit.
I think perhaps on a fundamental, well, I'm going to have to mute this.
We hear you very well.
Yeah, no, I'm getting too much feedback. Okay. I think perhaps on a fundamental level, a lot of these cognitive breaks that were discussed might not even happen. Haven't we always personalized everything? Aren't we basically hardwired sort of on a tribal level just to look at a maximum population size of 120? I think that probably would go a long way to explaining why climate change, for example, tends to reign less in the news than Paris Hilton's last drug trip. We tend to personalize things. And so I think to a large extent, the problem is not that world-changing calamities cause us to sort of shatter our worldviews. I wonder if perhaps the problem is our worldviews are so set in kind of a tribal Pleistocene state of hardwiring that it's basically just sort of in one synapse and out the other. That seems to be the whole problem. the more enormous the danger facing us, the less seriously we seem to take it. In the case of the Rifters book, I kind of got around that by positing people who had been neurologically rewired so that they could behave in a different way. But even they didn't really grasp the magnitude of the kind of problems we're talking about here. I suspect that if we really do want to come to terms with these kinds of issues, we're going to have to become something that's a little less human. By which I mean it is something that isn't quite so much run by our brain stems. Something with more of a sort of a neocortical basis, I would guess.
In Rifters and in Blindsight, you posit that that's accomplished through a technological scope of modifications, both to the physical parameters of the human, but also to the mental parameters of the human. So your characters in Rifters are, well, they are both conditioned and tortured to be pushed to a sort of a state of the, on the limit of the human. And your characters in Blindsight are absolutely modified on a neurological level as well as a physiological level. Especially in Blindsight, you take on this problem of the degree to which that modification would then highlight the use or the uselessness of higher cognitive functions. And I thought that was, if you could address that a little bit, it connects back to Tom's point again that there's a cognitive rupture that attends the kind of conditions that we're talking about, whether we're dealing with radical climate change or the emergence of a new kind of territory that Benjamin was outlining when we encounter new forms of soil.
Okay, I would have to disagree with at least part of the initial premise. The thing that I was questioning the utility of in Blindsight, I don't know if I'd describe it as a higher cognitive function. We're talking basically about the utility of consciousness. And there's a school of thought that says that consciousness is extremely expensive metabolically, that you can't really imagine anything that a conscious being does that a non-conscious meat robot could not do just as easily. That basically consciousness is kind of a maladaptive side effect, if you will. And that's kind of interesting in the context of what you're bringing up here. Because if you actually want to take what I present at face value, consciousness gets in the way. If you want to deal with sort of large earth-shattering or potentially earth-shattering issues, perhaps the best solution is to let our actual intelligence free. And because consciousness essentially acts as kind of a parasitic subroutine that sucks glucose from the brain that could be more effectively used in other areas. I mean, some studies put the bandwidth of consciousness as low as 20 or 30 bits per second. I mean, it's basically a little scratch pad that can hold a couple of phone numbers. Most of the heavy lifting is sort of done below the level of conscious thought. So if we can basically get rid of Dilbert's pointy-haired boss who takes credit for all the memos, and let Dilbert and Wally do things for a change, we might actually have a shot at finding these problems tractable. Of course, the downside of that is that we stop being anything that we consider valuable as human beings. But, nothing's free.
I just wanted to qualify the phrase that you took to me. No, it's okay, because you took it in a much more interesting way. But when I use the phrase cognitive rupture, I was kind of talking about that same territory. The fact that you have this revelatory sets of information and data that's basically being culturally digested minimally for the last decade or two, more and more now, but it hasn't produced a response or recognition. And on that level, whether you assign it to media or what we call consciousness, human consciousness, as a construct, it's disconnected. Whether it's from the point of view of denial, being very self-concerned and going about the way we absorb information, or merely the way the media. But nonetheless, we live in discourse. We live in language. So to some extent, what I would say is consciousness is simply the language we have to use or get away from or break with. But when I say rupture, I'm not saying, the future will rupture this. That may not be the case. What I'm saying is the reality that we've entered now is in such a contradiction to what we consider to be a kind of a normal state of truths and truisms referencing within the language we've inherited from the 20th century, that it's like, there's a disconnect. So I hope that at least modifies that phrase a little bit, make it more productive.
Okay, actually got it. So you can basically ignore about 70% of what I've said so far tonight.
I love that last part.
But I would like to point out, I mean, it actually raises another point. Insofar as if you're talking about ruptures, if we're forgetting about whether something is conscious or subconscious, there are in fact certain types of brain damage that allow us to become more rational and more ethical. There's a type of lesion that happens to the, I believe, the ventromedial lateral cortex. Anyhow, people who suffer this particular type of brain damage are suddenly able to, without a second thought, save 3 of somebody else's children and let 1 of their own children burn to death in a burning building. As far as I know, this experiment has not actually been done. But the type of damage is the sort that essentially allows one to make ethical decisions without that kind of an emotional tug. I don't know if we as a society are ready for that. I think that if somebody actually did that in real life, the headline would be much more likely to read "Mother abandons baby in burning building" rather than "Mother sacrifices child to save 3 others." But nonetheless, that's the kind of a bigger perspective I think that we need in order to be able to handle these, to sort of get away from these tragedy to commons issues. And I find it ironic that it entails what you really can't describe as anything other than brain damage.
Yeah, I just want to jump in here. It's fascinating sort of line of discussion. One of the things that Google does is monetize cognition. This is its business model. But every time you do a search and you click on something, you're training the algorithm, you're training the artificial intelligence a little bit more about what it is that humans know about semantic relationships between strings. And the economic value in aggregate of all of those little transferences of labor of training the algorithm is larger than the cost of the delivery of that service to you, and the ratio of one to the other we call Google's market capitalization. So I think one of the issues around this, the cognition of the break is also how it is that we learn to outsource cognition or subcontract cognition to these kinds of instrumental tools, which can't be separated from the question of what planetary computation is as a basic substrate. It's not only plumbing; it's also a cognitive mechanism. At the last DGP conference that we had in La Jolla with both Geoff and Ed spoke, Werner Vinge was also one of the speakers there as well. And Werner, one of the points that Werner made, he's the singularity guy, and one of the points that he made was about the Anthropocene. A lot of his talk was about the Anthropocene. But the argument that he made was, instead of it being something that we will look back on for many centuries hence, that it will actually be very, very short. Sort of a matter of decades, or I don't know exactly what he's phrasing, Ed may remember the phrasing exactly, but that, in Werner's narrative, when the singularity comes and the rapture of absolute, computational immanence and so forth and so on, that there'll be some kind of Cambrian explosion in externalized cognition in the wild in the matter of a few years. But there's some way in which we can link this, it seems to me, between, I think, what Peter's suggesting as the kind of the way out of the Anthropocene towards the post-Anthropocene is to finally leave the Pleistocene, to actually become literally potent, to actually accomplish the demise of humanity in this way, with the way Werner's talking about it. Now, one thing, though, that just struck me when Peter was talking about the evolutionary expense of consciousness was a remark that Lynn made last night about the evolutionary purpose of a lot of this, which was of as I take it, the price of the expensive consciousness is the way she saw it, the ability to adapt to change very quickly. That it was right. That it's simply that it's faster. In the way the example used, it's faster to learn how to make a fur coat than it is to evolve fur. It's faster to learn how to examine a landscape, to think about what would be good to tear off and make an artificial skin from, than to evolve fur. So the opportunistic ability to deal with changing the environment is part of the price of this as well. So maybe the question is, how do we amplify that? How do we if we're going to subcontract consciousness in this way, subcontract cognition, how do we do it in a way in which it can actually allow for the kinds of rapid scale changes that we're working with? Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's the rapid scale is quite the issue. This is the Paris Hilton problem.
That makes me, in a way, think of what Dylan has written about Ballard. And Dylan, if you can hear us, I think you can. Give us a thumbs up. Yeah. I think that's a thumbs up. Dylan, can you address the issue of outsourcing cognition that Ben was just going across? And see, it seems to me that one of the outcomes is an optimization. That when you bring up the point that Lynn made last night, she was saying that the environment within which we live is so variable that actually the larger gray matter, the larger brain is useful. It actually is optimized because that externalized intelligence, or the ability to in some way externalize intelligence and externalize phenotype as well as intelligence is viable in a variable landscape.
And that is the designing of the world.
Yes. But Ballard played it out in a different way, and the consequences of it out in a different way, by identifying a kind of a creeping, almost cosmological malaise that would take us over when we had gained access to this new territory. And again, Dylan, I hope that you can hear us, because it would be great if you could weigh in on this particular subject at this moment.
Sound off.
Dylan, can you hear us? That's terrible.
Maybe click on it.
You can't just make it.
Just like a chat thing.
Peter, are you still there?
I'm here.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
While we're trying to figure out if Dylan is coming on, or
Can we make a sign?
or Peter, can we make a sign like in Panic Room?
What do you need?
If there are
He has his finger on the mute.
audience questions as well, either about this or questions of island sovereignty, drowning islands, etc. Obviously, let us know.
Yeah, I got a question for Benjamin. Do you think in the future it would be possible for people to declare themselves to these internet states instead of being more so a citizen of like Google or Facebook or World of Warcraft than they are of the United States?
Well, I don't think it's a future issue. I think it's the answer is yes. Well, yes and no, and let me qualify it in this way. I think that there, at any point in time, one's identity, citizenship, allegiances are always plural, are always multitude, right? The number of jurisdictions, the number of institutions that make claim to you and make claim to your identity for legal, cultural, religious, locative, economic relationships is always plural, and the sort of the condition of public identity is the negotiation of those. And for different people, some ones are different higher in the stack, and for certain kinds of places, for example, the relation between a religious, the religious content or specificity of a state in a place like Israel or Saudi Arabia or Texas is always a bit, has a different flavor than it does in the rest of the in the rest of the world. One of our confederates at DGP is a group called Metahaven, based in Amsterdam, a graphic design group, and one of their projects that they're known for is called Face State, which was based on the idea that the collapsing European currency would be replaced by Facebook credits, and that the micrological nature of this currency would actually provide for a more stable reference standard for what currency would refer to, right? I mean, gold standards of magic rock from the ground, right? This is not a solution to anything, right? But the actual specificity, the network itself will provide this kind of record. So I think the more important question is less in terms of the kind of formal legal abstraction of what really counts at the end of the day in the court of law that Michael Gerard was thinking about, right? It's about when does the UN acknowledge that the identification, your Google ID is as important as your national passport, is not likely going to happen. But what are the conditions, very practically, what are the conditions of mobility, of passage, of individual or group or plural sovereignty, in which the kinds of transactions and access and safety and protection from precarity that your participation in those other kinds of much more complicated networks that are bound to this discontiguous planetary computation would bring forth. I think the question then is not when does that happen, what is it, at certain moments it's more important, at other moments it's less important. But really the question is given the potential for this, what would we want to scale from that, right? It's certainly not progress in any way to simply to say, okay, we're going to move away from one citadel institution of the nation state and simply hand it over to a publicly traded corporation as if this is going to somehow provide greater, greater forms of ultimate liberty and accountability, because we don't really have the terms for what the accountability of that identity is, especially the identity that is primarily monetized through the traces that it produces in the world and the monetization of those traces and so forth and so on. And then that question of what's monetization, what is money, and what is money referring to, all of these become these kinds of questions as well. So I can see several examples in which it would become equally important, all of which raise more questions than they actually solve. And I think that's probably why your question is an interesting one, for that reason.
I think just briefly, I'd love to just go back to maybe, as Tom was saying, half hour ago, maybe just put an asterisk around the word that seems to be widespread use of, which is consciousness, which I think that at the risk of getting into some sort of neuro-philosophical argument, I guess I would just say that I would very much problematize the idea that consciousness is something that is occurring right now in this room that we all have, and that it's a kind of cognitive state. But I feel like in 100 years, the word, whatever it is that we're doing, and whatever it is that's quote unquote happening right now, is not going to be referred to by the word consciousness. And I feel like it's more, we mentioned outsourcing cognition to objects, to iPads, to Google. Why memorize something when you can just Google it? Why remember what that website was when you can just save it in your bookmarks? There has always been an argument about outsourcing cognitive abilities like that, whether or not it's with the use of a dictionary, so you don't have to remember certain words, or a thesaurus, so you no longer have to remember what the alternatives are. I feel like there's almost like an auto-amputation where we're giving up things that would normally have been considered part of consciousness, and they become something that objects do. And so whatever it is that we're left with at the end of that, whether or not there's some sort of human kernel, which I would doubt actually, I feel like that is this argument that we have to get into if we're going to start referring to things like consciousness or the metabolic value of a term that, again, I think in 100 years, that word is not going to be used, and it's not going to be describing this. So just briefly, before we continue down that, to like totally change gears here, I feel like there's a really interesting terrestrial example of this, and this just goes back to islands and sovereignty and whatnot, where embarrassingly, I've forgotten what the island is, but I know that about, maybe a decade ago, in the mid to late 90s at least, there was an attempt by Australia to secede, or to give up sovereignty over an island, because of the rule being that if you physically reached this island, you could request and receive refugee status in Australia. And so there was an attempt to actually give up territory strategically and shrink the nation of Australia so that when people reached this place, they were, and Nicola was telling me earlier, I guess Michael Gerard was saying this, that they wanted to make what was an island into what is actually legally known, literally and legally known as a rock. It would be an island that doesn't have a state and that is not, it has no caretaker. It doesn't fall within any sort of a territorial jurisdiction of a nation. So anyway, I wonder both not only to sort of just bring things back down to earth a little bit and start talking about the ways in which these things are enacted politically, but also potentially offer the possibility that there are aspects of consciousness that once we sort of, the tide of the human pulls away, we would realize they're not islands, they're rocks. They're stateless. They're these things that we had incorporated and that we thought it was memory or we thought it was something else. And it turns out that in fact through this kind of giving up of terrain, this outsourcing of cognitive functions to objects, that we realized that all along it wasn't really ours and that in fact we wanted to get rid of it. So in any case.
I'll just add two quick points. Yeah, what is it? Yeah, you switched already from this word cognition just to memory. Okay? And I think when you get down to the technologies that we outsource to, we're outsourcing memory, among other things, and also platforming ourselves. That's interesting to keep in mind because memory is basically a technology. And therefore that which we scaffold ourselves upon is really not ours. The only other point I'd make on as a gloss on what you're saying, just to press that, and it goes back to this island disappearing. And I forget who, someone brought up this word homeland and preserve the culture. I would agree with you. I think it's a question of giving up the concept of home, giving up the semantic concept of propriety. Something in that has to do with how we think sovereignty. That's why I think this clutch, which it is, I believe, semantic, I think it's drilled into the way we define it, is already its tripwire for being able to try to think beyond, because we were still locked in that. And it doesn't come down to a simple kind of old-style political dismemberment of property. There's something else at stake that has to do with, just how we think. Last thing, if you're going to index this sort of conversation to the singularity, you have to be perfectly well aware that still reads like a redemption fantasy. And it's a redemption fantasy that then looks back on us and said the Anthropocene will get 30 years. I thought that was going to conclude not because we get transformed into the next being and look back at ourselves. We can do that already. Humans aren't defined by having, 2 hands and 2 feet and a head. Not exactly. It's a concept. It's a concept that's agreed to according to certain cultural forces. And in the world not so far removed from now, maybe including now, it tends to be defined by groups, and groups with power, and groups with kind of, say banker mafias, drug cartels. They're the humans, and the rest are not. So the human is by definition a strangely restrictive category. It doesn't name a species, in my estimation. It's kind of a relationship. It's quite damaged, utterly damaged. But I'll shut up now. I'm just going to push those things around.
Can you say something about what the language of the post-planetary, the language of the post-national, the language of post-consciousness looks like, or might look like? Does it have a language?
Well, maybe to Tom's point, which I think we agree with, is I think the fact that we're couching these things as post, trying to sort of keep these terms alive on crutches going forward in this sort of way is indicative that there's just a need for a kind of novel nomenclature that we just maybe aren't hardwired to speak yet. So maybe that's what we're
100 years ago, you might have said, Esperanto is the kind of planetary language par excellence, right? Sorry? Esperanto.
No, yeah, I think, I guess
this was 100 years ago, you know what I'm saying? And I'm wondering, is there a fantasy that accompanies the picture that you're painting for us? In other words, a fantasy about communication. In other words, a way of, does communication happen? And if so, how does it happen?
I think this is a very interesting place to connect back to an issue that Ben is working on a lot, that I've been working on a bit and talking with the research seminar about. It's massive addressability or deep addressability. And we've had a lot of conversations during the course of the semester, focusing a bit on Giorgio Agamben and Agamben's idea of the gesture and what the value of the gesture would be from an ethical point of view. Now, Agamben, when he's talking about the gesture, he's making the argument that the gesture is ethically appropriate for humans. He's not saying it is, he's arguing it should be. Because the gesture is that which indicates that another entity is trying to communicate, which of course for Dylan must have been extraordinarily poignant tonight as he watched this gesturing and could only hear some of what was going on. Another being is trying to communicate, but one doesn't really know, and one may never know what that other being is saying in his thinking. And so what Agamben's trying to do is say that the only way forward for humans, and you could probably kind of make a very strange reading of it and say within the approaching singularity, the only way forward for any entity in this kind of thermal howl of information is to assume that communication is trying to happen, but one might never be able to decode the signal. It's the communication with the alien problem. Now, obviously, we're kind of communicating now, and our participants are kind of hearing us. We're kind of exchanging information, but we're constantly looping around to build a shared vocabulary of what that might be. And I think actually the interesting thing about the point that Werner Vinge makes is the speed by which that looping around, the exchange of information, the verification that it might actually be from point A to point B, a shared concept that actually gets through, 100% signal communication, no signal loss, that loop is getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And the kind of outsourcing of cognition that Ben is talking about is also playing a role in that tightening of that loop. And it's playing a role also not just in speeding things up so that, Werner Vinge's Cambrian explosion of the mind will happen in 3 or 4 decades as opposed to 100 million years. It's not just a speeding up, but it's also a redistribution of mind. So in that sense, this idea that we might be building instruments with which we not only change the frame for communication, but we change the instrumentality of mind itself and externalize that, plays a role in this kind of language that you're asking the question about. So ultimately, I have a feeling that the downside of Agamben's argument could be we may all be unable to communicate, or at least, yeah, that's the downside. The upside might be we all might know that there are reasons for which we are unable to communicate, and know that there's an entity on the other end of the receiver, on the other end of the line. And in that case, Agamben's making the argument again that we have to lean forward, and that the ethics of that knowing there is some kind of entity out there, and leaning forward towards it, is the ethics of the post-human or the post-planetary or the post-singularity. So I think that was a very long way of putting it, but I think that's very much part of it, Ben?
Yeah.
I skipped the deep addressability.
Well, I could talk about that if we like. I would just want to make sure that there wasn't a miscommunication in that I don't think anyone who's saying that unlike Esperanto or some of the more any number of ways in which through the early and late periods of modernity, some idea of total integrative world communication will bring about inevitably a new cosmopolitan world peace and brotherhood of man, and the elimination of transparency, the elimination of opacity, and absolute liquidity of message flow between humans will bring this about. It's not in the least what I'm arguing for or suggesting is happening, but it's part of the discourse. I think as Tom talks about the ways in which these things are planned. It's more has to do with we are building an infrastructure at a planetary scale to which we are outsourcing this cognition. And whereas Esperanto was designed like how it is that with a kind of humanist project by which the long trajectory of classical humanism could reach a kind of post-national apogee, a new, post-Westphalian Babel. I think as we're talking about here today, this may be the condition that totally perforates and eradicates the human as the basic center for these political systems. And I think this goes to one of the questions that we're sort of working around here, which is the conditions of representation, and who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak within these sorts of issues going forward, and what are the conditions by which, at whatever scale, design or the mutability of these systems can be brought forward. And the tour has this whole, the parliament of things, and so forth and so on, which isn't really, which is a whole nother kind of discussion. If it's of interest, I think the deep address idea that Ed brought up is really this. It has to do with, is a research project that we're going on with at the Center for Design and Geopolitics that involves a number of people in different sorts of projects. But it's based on one thing, and that is the exploration of the philosophical and technological implications of very large-scale universal addressing systems. And the quick and easy example that I would give with this would be something like IP version 6. IPv4 addresses, the internet addresses, we will run out of them. There's only about 3 billion of them mathematically in the first place, there are 7 billion people. IP version 6, on the other hand, is 128-bit strings, theoretical address space that would provide for 7 billion people, something like 10 to the 23 addresses per person. It's an incomprehensibly large number, right? If you were to assign an individual address to everything that would, to you, count as an object over the course of your life, you would not ever exhaust 10 to the 23. Yeah? But if you were to assign an address to, let's say, a relationship between you and an object, right? So there's the chair you're sitting in, there's the shirt you're wearing, but there's the fact that that's your shirt, that's a relationship. The fact that you are in the shirt, sitting in the chair is a relationship. All of those relationships of relationships are all theoretically addressable as well, and all the way on down. So if the relations of relations of relations of relations, you could exhaust 10 to the 23 instantaneously down into the ultimate abyss of relationality as it goes all the way. So somewhere between never and instantly is the scope of that, of deep address, of how we would exhaust those kinds of things. Now the interest of this to me is not a kind of ubiquitous computing thing of how my toothbrush talks to my refrigerator. How my toothbrush will talk to my refrigerator, sort of ubiquitous computing thing. But rather how it is that something that exists at one scale of the world might shuttle literal information to something that exists on another scale of the world. In a literal form of communication that Ed is talking about in terms of this conditions of the ability to send and receive information. So a protein to a bioregion, a tree to a car, a building to things. Not that these entities in themselves are specific, but across the sort of Eames scales of 10, excuse me, that instances or entities across these scales can now in fact be in direct informational contact because there's some sort of mechanism of theoretical exchange by which they work with. And that's to me this issue, the deep address, this condition of deep addressability, where that question of communication goes to, and how it fits into these other issues of sovereignty or whatever word we come up to replace it. I'll let everyone else figure out.
And maybe just to throw something out there too, I mean, I feel like this maybe answers a slightly different question, but I just say I guess two things. One, this came up last night with the NASA woman, Lynn Rothschild, where we were talking about there's this idea that maybe in fact there is this kind of intergalactic internet of lasers that's been occurring in deep space, and we just haven't found it yet. And that in fact, if we were to use gravitational lensing and we were to get as far out as Pluto, maybe we'll see this internet of lasers that's shooting through the universe right now. So vis-a-vis communication, vis-a-vis the quote-unquote post-planetary in an extremely literal sense. You know, if we leave the Earth in a literal, physical, gravitational way, you know, we'll discover this new sort of technological informational exchange. But what I think is really interesting about that is that, well, I mean, are the obvious points that, you know, it was radio, and that was when, you know, radio communication, when we were using radio. Oh, of course the aliens are going to be using radio. Now that we're using lasers, and we have optical readable discs, and we have the optical internet and fiber optic cables, etc., we're going to be, oh, well, of course the aliens are going to be communicating with lasers. So the technology at the time informs what we think the most advanced aliens aliens might be using. So just then subset A and B of that. A, I think there's a book that it's difficult to recommend, but at the same time I find it's actually very, very good for totally annihilating the idea that radio and laser are the ways to communicate with the alien, which is a book called The Eerie Silence by Paul Davies. It's difficult to recommend other books by Paul Davies, but I find that I literally had me laughing out loud about just the absolute absurdity. Maybe this is more about me, but about the absurdity of radio communication with alien intelligences, quote unquote. So I think that's a really interesting book for the timescales, the technological dissipation of signals over large expanses of time, and it really just puts the whole question of communication under a giant question mark. But then, but just briefly though, then the B is that neutrinos are this new thing, and I think it's just interesting that there's this new idea that we could use neutrinos as about what is it called again? High frequency trading. And using speed of light trading for stock market manipulation, etc. It's an unbelievably interesting field. It's also very problematic financially and economically, but they're now talking about using neutrinos as a sort of literally like a terrestrial stock market, where neutrinos are these cosmic objects passing through the Earth, passing through us, but in reality, if you could financialize them in kind of insane Google meets Mars idea, we're actually intersecting on a planetary level with financial structures, like something out of a Charles Strauss novel. And I feel like, the sort of weird avant-garde of the financial system right now.
But there was the piece that you
say that again? Sorry.
That's the curvature of the Earth.
This was the piece that you wrote on the financial the financial curve, and it was on the curve. So the way to get past the problem of the speed of light is
using neutrinos. I can't. I won't even pretend that I can explain how they're going to do it. But that's as of 10 days ago, there was an article about using neutrinos for high frequency trading. So I don't know. You can extrapolate from that. But actually, so one more thing really briefly though is that you said, what does the post-planetary look like? I would just say briefly that I feel like when I might use the word post-planetary, and I'll try to be brief on this, I would actually tend to say post-terrestrial for a lot of reasons, but I actually find that being someone who's very, very interested in geology, and by working at Columbia now, having access to tons of academic geology journals, what I think is so incredibly interesting about economic geology, about industrial geological exploration, about the instrumentation used to explore what is beneath the surface of the Earth, what is the surface of the Earth, is that they're constantly discovering and trying to rhetorically understand and frame events that seem utterly non-terrestrial or utterly alien, where you get the formation fronts of gold beneath Arizona or beneath Nevada, and how they're described as these kind of it's somewhere between H.P. Lovecraft and 1,000 Plateaus, but it's by Rio Tinto, or it's by these other kind of mining companies that are encountering something in the Earth that is distinctly unearthly if we look at it from the perspective of the humanities, or the perspective of the picturesque, or of a kind of poetic, descriptive tradition. And so I think that's really interesting in the sense that maybe that's what the post-planetary looks like. It's the thing that we're on right now. It's just that we're only discovering it because we finally have the instrumentation and the language and a new type of descriptive practice that lets us look at objects and events inside the Earth's surface that we would otherwise ascribe to science fiction. So anyway, I realize that sidesteps your question a little bit, but I think that to me that's what the post-planetary looks like. It looks like geological exploration here. It looks like the strange kind of mineral fronts and the strange geological objects that we encounter literally here. So anyway, I think that's also the post-planetary.
That's to bring in Reza.
Yeah, we could bring up Reza Negarestani's work. We could bring up Ballard. I'm going to see Dylan. You could hear that part. Could you?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I've got you on quite loud here. We can hear you very well. I wonder if, because of what Geoff was just outlining in terms of the kind of post-terrestrial, I wonder if you could address the way that Ballard takes that on in Crystal World, Drowned World, memories of the Space Age, because in all of those he's really quite directly attempting to take on that problem of what it means for us to become conscious of that, not just subjectively conscious, but physically, ontologically conscious. There's kind of this creeping malaise was the term I used earlier.
Yeah, well, I suppose what interests me about Ballard in this discussion is the idea of a post-planetary body, physical body, a human body. And he seems in a way to reinforce certain claims that are made in the philosophy of the body, particular phenomenology of the body. Principally this idea that the world, the spatiality of the world is not something that exists out there, but nor is it something that is constructed purely inwardly as a sort of subjective experience, but it takes place in this symbiotic hybrid between the body and the world. And the interesting thing in this discussion of post-planetary design is, of course, that he pushes this towards outer space and then pursues this speculative thinking about the role of the body as it is then brought back down to the earth. And his themes of sort of spatial transgression and pathology, and this whole idea of space ignorance, in which space and time are augmented and sort of more with these strange, uncanny intrusions and patterns. Although it is thematically very exotic, it nevertheless captures something that we already are, is part of our experiential MK world. And this is this strange ambiguity between inner and outer space, which we return to time and time and again. So, yeah, I can answer your question. But
well, I think maybe what we might do, just in the interest of time, is end the panel discussion, and we will segue into a video that Dylan has prepared for us. And while that's playing, have some more wine, and we can have some conversations in the room with Dylan getting a pride of place here on the wall, so we can go out with Boulardi and bang. Maybe before we do that, we can just thank the online panelists, and I'll thank everyone here.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan, for staying up until 3 in the morning in Paris.
that's a pleasure. I'm a night out, so it's no problem.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan.
And thanks, Peter, for joining us and persevering. We lost Adrian in there along the way, but I'll loop him back in after the event.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks to our panelists here, Benjamin, Bratton, Tom Cohen, and Ed Keller. Yeah, you guys are always fun to talk to, and thanks for you guys for sticking around. Appreciate it. And yeah, have some more wine. We'll be listening to Dylan Trigg's video in the background, and feel free to hang out and ask any other questions that you might have. So, cool. Thanks.